We have two speakers, Dr. Aaron Eldridge and Dr. Arsalan Khan. Thank you so much for joining us here today. The topic of this panel is the politics of spiritual ethicality. Our speakers will present for a half an hour each, and then we'll open it up to the discussant and then the audience. So without further ado, Dr. Eldridge.
Well, thank you all very much indeed for being here today, and I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. So I want to especially thank Professor Nauman Naqvi for extending this invitation and in re-extending it, actually. Extremely generous of him, and for Ms. Hina Melek and her team for facilitating my travel to Karachi. So my comments today, on this theme, turn on a reading of, in fact, an Arab Orthodox Christian text. So this is a tradition called Rum Orthodox in Arabic. The book title is I'tiraf wa Tahlil al-Nafsi, which can be translated as Confession and Psychoanalysis, written by Aspiro Jabor in the 1990s in Homs in Syria, and published in 1980s, I should say, and published in 1990. So, and I should just say that I've worked with this text a lot. There's a translation coming out, inshallah, soon with Fordham University Press. So this text stages an encounter between Freudian psychoanalysis and Eastern Orthodox monastic tradition, specifically the latter's practice of asceticism anchored in irshad. So this is spiritual guidance under a sheikh. There are many terminologies that will be familiar here. I encountered this book through my ethnographic work between 2016 and 2019 in Lebanon, on Arab Orthodox Christian monastic sites. So I'm an anthropologist by training. My research was primarily concerned with the growing communities of men and women monastics in the aftermath of the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted from 1970 to 1990, and in the midst of increasing economic dispossession and state sectarianism. So Jabor himself was born in al-Muzayra in the Syrian province of Latakia or Latakia, in 1923, and he was an influential ascetic at one of these monasteries in which I did ethnographic work, Marjorgios ad-Dar Harf, which is in the Shuf, so sort of like south of Beirut into the mountains, and so he died in 2018, Allah yarhamuhu. So this is the monastery of Marjorgios. So perhaps despite initial appearances, I'tiraf wa Tahlil al-Nafsi, written from within Jabor's Eastern and Arab Orthodox Christian tradition, has in fact bearing on our topic today, what I take to be Professor Naqvi's call to attend to the question of ethics in the Muslim post-colony. So this is how I propose to read this text today. And indeed, it displays a subtle fluency in many Islamic grammars, a fluency that readers may find remarkable. More importantly, it is hardly possible to understand the contours of Jabor's argument concerning the nafs, the psyche or the soul, and the question of ethics it poses without knowledge of the concepts and practices that are crucial to Islamic traditions in the Middle East as elsewhere. So the text not only contains a number of explicit references to Islamic tradition, for example in the listing of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali among the righteous Eastern Christian ascetics, a reference to Muslim Sufi forms of spiritual guidance under a sheikh, the consistent use of the number of the 99 Asma' Husna, so the divine names or beautiful names of God that constitute the divine attributes, but it works within a more subtle grammatical form, and forms, I should say, recognizable in Islamic tradition. So irshad, spiritual guidance, sujud, jihad, zuhud, nusk. I can gloss these, but I'm guessing the audience is familiar with these terms. Muraqaba, watchfulness, kufr, infidelity to God, ad-dunya, the lower world, dhikr, remembrance of God and death, the nafs and the ruh. So the reading of the text I offer here, in that sense, does a double work. So here I develop both how the text reads the nafs folded across the grammars of Islamic and Eastern Christian traditions in relation to psychoanalysis, and how it situates its own relationship to a loss through a remarkable participation in one Islamic genealogy at the linguistic site of the term Sufi. So the concrete usage of these grammars by Jabor is, I argue, crucially asecular, and you glean this from the title of my talk. And I take this term from Hossein Agrama, insofar as it is indifferent, this text I'm arguing, to the specific problem of religious difference. So Islamic genealogies here are not indexed, but simply part of this form of life. They're not remarked upon. So in this, Jabor points to, as he addresses a loss at the site of what I call Dār al-Islām, he calls it the Mashriq. So this conceptual topology I'm offering here for theorizing this specific historical space. So we could equally call this space the Muslim post-colony, but tactically speaking, this is to reaffirm, at least here, a way in which this secular work makes theorizing this text's imbrication with Islamic tradition impossible. And so one could simply note, even when we're looking at the colonial work of excising Eastern Christians from indigenous spaces within Dar al-Islam, this is a kind of colonial effect that we have seen all too recently in Gaza, where Christian death is sort of exceptionalized and partitioned away from Muslim and Palestinian death in general. So, to turn first to the text's argument and gesture, ihtiraf wa tahleel al-nafsi is organized around the problem of lucidity about the condition of life in the post-colony. Indeed, the Arabic reader will note that ihtiraf invokes not only the particular right or relationship of Christian confession, but the capacity for recognition. The text is an attempt, Jabur writes, one aimed at an audience identified as the growing number of those holding to spiritual endeavors, men and women ruhban, so monastics and intellectuals. But the author, rather than offer himself in the position of one who is supposed to know, is implicated in his own address. So perhaps these readers, and myself, he writes, will tear away the thick veil of transgressions that veil the brilliance of the divine light residing within us. So this text, in its own words, establishes itself as a bahath, so a searching. Nothing but a research framework is how he puts it, and he uses heikel there, so a temple for this search for lucidity and illumination. The terrain of the modern nafs, the psyche and the soul, is the site that orients this framework. So Jabur's address is aimed at the benefit of the Arabic reader, if only, he laments, to a limited degree. So the Arabic reader here is present absent in the text. On the one hand, the text is the first step in volumes that will be arduous, asir, for the Arabic reader, and yet Jabur laments future texts will not be in Arabic, for no one reads them and no one funds them. Jabur himself is a victim of what he describes, as he writes, of darkness and opacity, in a kind of exile that is not an elsewhere against a here, but an estrangement within the very lattice of terms that knit together social and cultural life in the Mashriq, its relations, labors, and institutions. So this estrangement, born in the difficulties of the colonial and post-colonial world into which Jabur was born, is, as he describes, an encounter with the counterfeit. So this is al-Muzayif. He sort of lambasts French Christianity's neglect of the poor as a counterfeit, but he also talks about European scientists who first devised nuclear weapons to be rightly counterfeit scientists. Counterfeiting is, quote, the greatest of illnesses, and it threatens the struggle for lucidity. There is an ever-present danger, then, of a counterfeit struggle. So, in indeed addressing his readers, Jabur concludes, we are counterfeit Christians all. So Jabur conceptualizes the problem of the counterfeit through this crucial term tadad, ambivalence. This term is one that developed over the course of Freud's work as well, from a means of characterizing the love-hate relation to the object within childhood development into a means of understanding the death drive, the Todestrieb, at the outbreak of the First World War. So Freud would develop this ambivalence of feeling, as he calls it, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, as a means of grasping at what does not follow the homeostatic logic of the organism's pleasure principle. In his latter writing, Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud would finally formulate the, quote, conflict of ambivalence as the eternal struggle between eros and the destructive death drive. And so Jabur, for his part, reads this struggle as a counterfeit, one that is generated by athira, or self-love. So much as the First World War and its fascist aftershocks occasioned Freud's push to conceptualize the problem of the drive, Jabur takes the historical mire of Lebanon's sectarian war as another historical eschatological iteration of a tendency to destruction. So this is ambivalence, he writes. It is the cause of the alternation of our history between construction and destruction. We have a pronounced image of this in the harrowing events of Lebanon. After an amazing and long period of progress, civilizational upbuilding, Umran, construction and cohabitation, the fires broke out. And then he asks, how did people alternate between the positives of building and the negatives of raising? How did this excessively lively, stable, and secure country change to a country of the human being's destruction and extermination? How did people change from being affectionate and compassionate in hardships and crises to men of ruthlessness and barbarism? How did the human being become cheaper than a bushel of radishes? And so then he has this remark, aphoristically almost, the war has exposed the core, ma'adin, of the human being. And I think that, just as a note, the reason I wanted to put this full quote up on is because when we turn to Gaza today, in indeed anguish, I think the meaning of Jabur's quandary is palpable. The war presents a kind of exposure. The war in Gaza presents a kind of exposure. And the question then to be asked is, what do we do with what's being exposed? So Jabur takes the drive of self-love as the knot that binds the historical conjuncture and the formation of the nafs. This is the psyche or soul. So quote, the largest evidence for ambivalence in our formation is the evil of our social relationships. This evil is defined by the dissemblance of the social, an absence of trust and a strong bond between different members of the community. So an attentive listener will hear the echoes of Ibn Khaldun's dialectic of destruction and construction in his Muqaddimah, and indeed Jabur was engaged in Ibn Khaldun's thought, which tracks the weakening of group feeling, the famous Asabiyya, and the decay of courage among the denizens of the city. Jabur looks to the ways that ambivalence manifests the fact of the counterfeit. Sectarian affinities, in turn, are superficial relationships to the shells of religious affiliation. Our religiosity is superficial, Jabur writes, because we are unable to set ourselves to the turmoil of spiritual struggle. So this constant alternation in the state of the nafs of civilization cannot resolve itself. One develops, Jabur writes, love and hate for the same person, and this is deep-rooted in our life. We love food and we destroy it. We love the breast which nursed us and we bite it. It is, as Jabur surmises, the very problem of the heart. So do you see how the genius of the Arabic language succeeded, he continues, in that it named the heart qalb, because it is inconstant, mutaqallib, unfixed in a permanent state. Yet it is also named the core, al-lub, and thus it also appears that it is both the deepest as well as the changeable, inconstant in states and conditions. And this is what he calls a clear ambivalence. So science of the soul pursued by the text brings the problem of the counterfeit into view. It marks the fact of withdrawal, not only of his Christian tradition, but of those of the social and cultural life in Dār al-Islām as a supervening problem. So Jabur adds that ambivalence is not equatable to the nafs and the heart with its threading into a human history, but it ramifies objectively through the field of language itself. And so while Jabur was in Paris for a very short time, he studied contronyms, adad, so this is the same root as ambivalence in Arabic. And so I was trying to think of some examples, but in English anyways, cleave would be a contronym. So cleave both means to put things together and to take them apart. So ambivalence on the order of the sign becomes a testament in Jabur's decisive formulation, which I want to focus on here. So ambivalence is a problem in the hollow, the jawf, of every human being, but it is so extensive for us as to exceed limits of intelligibility, and our language bears witness to us. So I read the sentence as bearing out an ambivalent and contronymic tendency in itself. The jawf, like the heart, is both hollow and full of struggle. It is the innermost core, but also that which is lacking and void, the subterranean margin that is also the center. And in this text, jawf is unmarked, but it actually has, as I've discovered, an important genealogy in Islamic traditions and Quranic commentaries. So specifically, jawf is used as a term to explicate the meaning of asamid in Surah 112, al-Ikhlas. So Bismillah. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. So a translation, say, He is God, the one, God, as-Samad. He begets not, nor was He begotten, and there is none comparable to Him. So the term as-Samad has a polysemy in its translation. It may be translated as eternal or absolute, but it has a more specific meaning of compactness and solidity. According to Christos Similidis, translators have misunderstood, for example, the 9th century Arab Orthodox bishop Tawadrus Abu Qura, his translation of as-Samad into Greek. His vexing translation of asamid through the Greek term spheropektos has been speciously thought to mean an idol, and so a kind of right sectarian claim, hammered together, closely united. But Similidis argues that it is rather a faithful rendering of the Arabic term, quote, something which is without hollowness, consisting of one solid entity. So this is relevant in so much as the use of jawf, hollow, becomes central to understanding as-Samad and its use in the Surah Al-Ikhlas. So Ibn Kathir's magisterial exegesis of the Quran, 8th century after Hijrah, notes as-Samad is that which has no jawf, so la jawf lahu. And he adds, this is very gharib, this is very strange. Our Lord is He who is steadfast, yasmad, toward Him in needs. He who has perfected His sovereignty, and He is as-Samad, which has no jawf. Neither does He eat nor drink. He is who endures, baqi, after His creation. So Similidis himself quotes an earlier commentary of At-Tabari, and this is 3rd century after Hijrah, which also describes as-Samad as something without a hollow. So this is in distinction to the human being, which At-Tabari's commentary explains has a hollow. And so here is the passage fully quoted. So when God created Adam, the angels passed by him and were alarmed when they saw him. But the most alarmed of them was Iblis. and he would pass by and strike him, and the body would make a sound like pottery makes, and it had a hollow ring, whereupon he says, he created man of a clay like that of a potter. And he would say, you were created for some reason. He would go in through Adam's mouth, and he would come out through his rear. Then he would say to the angels, do not be afraid of this. Your Lord is solid, samad, but this is hollow. Indeed, if I'm given power over it, I shall utterly destroy it. So, Jabur's use of Jawf seemingly draws on this history of commentaries as he extends it to modulate Freud's hypothesis of the ambivalence of the drive, and so the counterfeit. In contrasting Jawf explicitly with the divine quality of Samad, the commentaries highlight the gap between creation and the uncreated, which, as we know, is a kind of critical pivot point here. He is who endures after his creation. So unlike the uncreated, who neither eats nor drinks, and therefore this is the condition of why it's ikhlas, why God has fidelity, the human being's relationship to creation and the void is given in the structure of the body's orifices, which are, of course, of great interest to psychoanalysis, of the oral and the anal, through which Iblis travels, that makes possible ambivalence, as in Jabur's example, loving and destroying food, the breast. So the human being here is a kind of structure that Jabur calls a body and is likened to a pot by At-Tabari. And this structure is quite literally shaped around nothing. It is, like all creation, suspended between the one who is Samad, God, the divinity, and the void. I am lack, Adam, Jabur writes. Or rather, I approach lack, because lack is the loss of existence, and the loss of existence is not of evil. I am a being wallowing in iniquities, plagued by transgressions, and this is as near as possible to lack. It is precisely the perception of this lack, or jawf, for Jabur, that opens up the possibility of lucidity and an awareness of the counterfeit struggle. So to return to his earlier line, the wars expose the core of the insan, of the human being. So in this, the jawf, which, as we have already noted, is resonant with the contronymic conception of the heart and the nefs in Jabur's text, is a pivot point around which authentic struggle can be articulated. The counterfeit struggle is one that is driven by self-love, defined by a desire to fill the jawf. So quoting Jabur again, quote, eating is a ferocious and devouring fire. If the human body had the capacity for its ambitions, he would swallow the whole of being, al-kawn. And again, I think we should look to the ontotheology of nationalism, and right now Israeli nationalism is precisely this same impulse. The true struggle for Jabur is ascetic and engages the ambivalent drive of eating and defecating. Quote, for the monastic, these are equivalent: food and its lack, drink and its lack, possession and its lack, marriage and its lack. These are not attributable to positive or negative elements, but precisely to the equivalence of their existence and its non-being, because the monastic lives as one who possesses and is not a possessor, as one who eats and is not an eater. So, this is a Gramus square. I'll explain what this is in a moment. So it is this struggle at the site of the jawf. The jawf appears at the same site as divine illumination. What is hollow can be illuminated after all, and this is a very, I think, a recognizable instruction that we hear from multiple traditions, that the emptiness of the heart is filled by the divine. So sketching out his discursive topology, one finds that the site of illumination and the void occur in the same place here. So at the bottom you see divine illumination and jawf. This is what also Jacques Lacan calls in his own topology the real. So this leads to a critical kind of topography of the inner and the outer, the manifest and the hidden, which act in an inverse relationship to each other and populate the terms of the conscious and the unconscious. So, and just because I know we have aspiring scholars here, I hope, young students. So Gramus square works by producing a set of contraries that form, it's just a map of discourse. People tend to think it's a map of reality, but it's actually just a map of discourse. And so if you begin with the first term, the zahir, the manifest, you produce its contrary, the batin, the hidden, and that produces the contradiction of the batin, which is shu'ur, which is consciousness, and that in turn has its own contrary, which is la shu'ur. And so then these different contraries, and the contraries go parallel to each other with the arrows, and the contradictions go across, and they produce these different fields of implication, you could say. And so this whole movement or dialectic around what is conscious and unconscious has also in its center a gap. It's a kind of circulation that works around the jawf. So there is something that is neither shu'ur nor la sha'ur, which is the jawf, but is also God, right, the uncreated. So this kinetics of transference, which we see at the top, precisely unfolds on the surface of creation, on the limit between the hidden and the manifest, the unconscious and the conscious. And so for Jabur, like other of these monastics, depth is a kind of delusion or a vectorial mistaking of divine desire for the self. So in this topological shift, which is also tajalli, tahwil could also be tajalli, disclosure, the jalf becomes the possibility of divine light. And I think we talked about it almost a bit yesterday, but Al-Ghazali's Mishkat al-Anwar, the niche of lights, is a kind of amazing, would be amazing to read with this kind of formulation, because there manifestation and hiddenness give witness to divine light. So the site of illumination is a concept marked by a particular grammatical operation in the text, and this is kind of the most important point. So as we said, this is a bahith, or a searching for a kind of lucidity about the fact of the jawf. And so this searching takes on a particular grammatical operation in the text, which is marked by Sufi. In Freud's theory, Jabur writes, reaction formations are moral reactions that repress the instincts. Meekness represses anger, for example, but rather in orthodoxy, in his tradition, the true ethics are of a Sufi character. This is what he writes. Within them, meekness is a new Sufi acquisition based on the transference of anger into love. So this is a very strange usage already. So the use of the term Sufi triangulates for Jabur a kind of aim for this search, but it remains inadequate and insufficient. It is thus one that he partially displaces in the text and through the development of what borders on a neologism, which is Khaliliyya, which he takes principally as a means of translating the Greek term mystikos, from the Greek text that he's using. So the use of Khalili might sound familiar to people because Khalil as a noun denotes an intimate friend, but more importantly it's used as an epithet for Ibrahim, Khalil Allah, the intimate of God. And so this is drawn both from Isaiah, where it says, "You, O Israel, my servant, O Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Ibrahim, my friend, Khalili," as well as hadith sayings attributed to the Prophet and in the Quran itself. And who is more good in religion than he who delivers his face to Allah, doing what is good, and following the creed, the millah of Ibrahim, with right inclination? Allah took Ibrahim as an intimate, a Khalil. So Jabur's striking adjectival and adverbial usage of the term Khalili is a way of invoking the specific creed or way of Ibrahim, invoked both by Quran and by the Sufi commentaries that followed it. And now the most striking part of this, which I cannot go into because as we see we're already getting into the weeds, is that the most striking commentary of Al-Khalil is Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam, which I've still yet to find a good translation for. People say bezels of wisdom, but I find this a strange word. So this text, remarkably, Fusus al-Hikam, is the source also of Egyptian psychologist Yusuf Murad's term for translating the Freudian unconscious into Arabic, so al-Sha'ur, in the 1940s. This term is likewise drawn from, this term is drawn from within Fusus al-Hikam, from the episode recounting Ibrahim's vision to sacrifice his son Ishaq. So the previous chapter in Ibn Arabi's text, however, treats Ibrahim's divine attribute of rapturous love, the hikmah muhayyamiyya, and it begins, quote, "He was called al-Khalil, an intimate, because he was penetrated, takhallal, and encompassed all that by which the divine in himself is described. The poet has said, 'You have penetrated, takhalta, the course of my spirit,' and by this al-Khalil was called an intimate." So Jabur's text, remarkably, invokes precisely this meaning of al-Khalil through his translation of mystikos, which mystikos is an adverbial form and an adjective. Mystikos is adverbial, and mystikos is, they almost sound the same, but that's adjectival. And so he does this kind of maneuver where there's a standardized translation where you say sirri, but he says khalili instead. And so this term khalili appears 4 times in Jabur's text, once as an adverb for mystikos, twice as an adjective for mystikos, and finally as a noun. And so these are the 4 kind of iterations, and all 3, 1, 2, and 4 are all translations of Maximus the Confessor, who is a 7th century, people say Palestinian actually, but Constantinopolitan and Greek ascetic and writer. And so you have this kind of formation, this translation formation where you get things like Jesus was born in a bodily spirit, restoring as Khalili, Sufi, birth in the spirit. So I'm not translating this to try to keep the strangeness of what it presents also for the Arabic reader. And likewise, Christ is ever born in the Khaliliya manner. And these are his glosses, Sophia, mystic, from the soul. And mystic is kept in a French, it's kept in Latin script. So in the life of the Khaliliyun of Allah, that is the Sufis of the mystics, withdrawing to the materials well known, these are obviously fragments. And the Khalili water, the mystic Sufi. So as we see, there's a kind of enjambment of translation that's being affected here. Khalili is this strange, nearly opaque term for Jabor's readers, and so it kind of is consistently glossed with these two terms, this Sufi, or al-Mutasawwifun, or the mystics, or le mystique. So there's this constant kind of maneuvering to try to get at this thing that needs to be pursued. And so here is a kind of mapping of what he's doing, or at least how I read what he's doing. So the final two exegesis, that is the Sufi and the mystic, are exogenous, and they're actually inverted forms of one another. So the Sufi names an outside rather, that is inside the grammatical coordinates of the language of the reader. So the Sufi marks a kind of difference. Its connotation articulates an internal difference between Islam and Eastern Christianity. The mystique names an inside that is outside the grammar of the Arabic reader as another iteration of this different Christian tradition, a French and Latin one. And as I said before, in the text, the majority of the text is written in Arabic, but these mystique moments, they remain in Latin script. So this connotation articulates an external similitude. And so these exogenous glosses follow as an obscuring clarification, one could say, again, hiddenness and manifestation of Khalili, to which they refer. So it thus marks a transposition of the absent term, which is mystikos there, through this is also what Michel de Certeau calls an exercise of the other in relation to a given site. So here you have, just to make sure people are understanding how this works. So mystikos, there's a transposition in the translation of mystikos to Khalili. I realize I left mystikos in Greek, but that's what in the far left at the top, that's what that word means. That transposition is affected through this kind of circulation through these different forms of exogeneity. And this is how he's delimiting this manner of being Khalil, being like Ibrahim. So Jabor triangulates this opaque term for his reader through Sufi and mystique, as I've said, but they remain insufficient to what is trying to be conveyed. And he writes elsewhere in our book, Al-Muzayyafun, the counterfeits, we made use of the term al-Mukhallala rather than the term at-tasawwuf. So this al-Mukhallala rather than Sufism, because divine blessing pierces us, tatakhallal, yeah, and abides in our whole creaturely being. The term at-tasawwuf does not lead to this implication. So this points in short to those who follow in the path of al-Khalil, being formed out of what is in the Arabic term a nisba adjective, Khalili, so there should be a shadda over it. The grammatical form of nisba, of course, as people may know, relates to nasib, the social tie, and its counterform of hasib, the account. So as Stefania Pandolfo writes, one of my teachers, in a book called Impasse of the Angels, tracing the dynamics of these forms in the life of a Moroccan village, quote, nasib is the valley of articulation, the forming of form, where hasib belongs to the foundational order, the positive affirmation of one's lineage, the rules of poetry, the order of the law. Nasib belongs to what she calls an interstitial order, the, quote, empty space between two terms of a binary system. And this, I think, is precisely the rahma and the rahim that Professor Naqvi spoke about so beautifully yesterday. So this emptied space, which is the space of ethics, is where we can read Al-Qashani, the follower of Ibn Arabi, who writes again about this Khalil. So, quote, the realization of the servant with the attributes of the truth, al-haq, whereby the truth penetrates, yatakhallal him, and he is not emptied of what has manifest upon him of his attributes. It is in this sense that Jabor coordinates the emptying of the mashriq with the possibility of divine disclosure. So Al-Mashriq, he writes, has gifted the Christian world its theological structure and its ascetic mystic Sufi structure, so this Nuski Sufi structure. What has remained in our life of this inheritance? Ignorance that we are holders of this inheritance has remained. The framework of the search, the orchestration of this new science of the nafs circulates within an emptied space. As we can even see, this is grammatically taking place. The sight that is at once exiled from its content, void, as we have seen, is also what makes divine illumination possible. This inversion occurs in the final lines of Jabour's text. The nothing that remains is ignorance of a loss that cannot be spoken. It is reversed here. So he says, quote, if hatreds have ripped our land apart piece by piece, and he's writing about Syria, he's writing about the Levant, which the story has not changed. If hatreds have ripped our land apart piece by piece, then nothing remains but love, divine sustenance, patience, and long-suffering, to set that which was broken and to restore Allah to our hearts, rotted by the worm of hatred and its ilk. So just in brief closing, I will say that Jabour's text, I think we need to read it from within the historical situation of Dār al-Islām. So this requires a kind of capacious reading practice, and one that perhaps we are not familiar with. So it would be one in which it is not only the archive of an imbrication between Muslim and Eastern Christian traditions that has a kind of durée, that endures a kind of colonial present, but this is a living form of address, a grammatical transformation that is only possible within the space of colonial loss, this space that is a fold between Islam, Eastern Christianity, and other forms of life, which are now suffering radical dispossession. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for coming. I want to thank Habib University for inviting me, Noman Naqvi especially for extending the invitation, and for all my wonderful panelists who've presented, from whom I've learned a great deal. Today I'm going to present a small snippet, part of my book manuscript, forthcoming book manuscript on the Tablighi Jamaat in Pakistan, so it'll be slightly more familiar, I think, historical, political context. So in the interest of time, let me just get into it. Basically, my overall interest is in how Tablighis constitute the sphere of religion, and how they understand the sphere of religion, how that's manifest in religious practices of dawat, how they separate that from the dunya, how they separate that from politics in particular, which is what I will today discuss, how the sphere of religion and politics are separated, and the political relevance of that in Pakistan. The Tablighi Jamaat is a transnational Islamic movement that began in the 1920s in North India, but has now a major presence in many parts of the world, especially where there are large South Asian populations. Pakistan is one of the 4 major centers of Tablighi activities, along with India, Bangladesh, and England, with hundreds of thousands of Muslims from Pakistan and around the world that attend the annual congregation, the Ijtima in Raiwind, as well as in the congregations in the major cities in other parts of the world. Since the 1980s, the Tablighi Jamaat has grown dramatically in Pakistan, as evidenced by the large mosque complexes that have sprung up in all major cities in the country. These mosque complexes serve as key institutional nodes in a network of mosques that are informally affiliated with the movement. The Tablighi Jamaat falls squarely in the Deobandi tradition of Islamic reform that grew to prominence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in South Asia, centered on the Darul Uloom seminary at Deoband in North India. The Deobandi ulama advocate a return to the authentic Islam as it is manifest in the Quran, understood as the word of God, the prophetic tradition, sunnat, as documented in the hadith literature, and Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, as outlined by the reformist ulama. A central goal of the Deobandi ulama has been adopted by the Tablighi Jamaat is to reform, and the word here is Islah, Muslim practices of what they see as illicit innovations, bid'at, and bring them back into line with the original Islam of the Quran and prophetic tradition. So it's all about returning to this idea of the original Islam and purifying Islam of what they see as corruptions and contaminations. The Tablighi Jamaat emerged to spread the teachings of the Deobandi ulama beyond the confines of the madrasa. Tablighis insist that their method of preaching, tariqa-e-tabligh, follows the Prophet's example, and therefore, like all of the Prophet's actions, is divinely inspired. It is only this form, they insist, that is efficacious in spreading Islamic virtues and capable of communicating God's will and command. Dressed in shalwar kameez, Islamic topi, and sporting long flowing beards as per sunnat, Tablighis can be seen walking through Pakistan's villages, towns, and cities, preaching the merits of Islamic practice, inviting, which is the literal meaning of the word dawat, fellow Muslims to the mosque to listen to sermons, discuss religion, and encouraging Muslims to join them in giving dawat to others. Tablighis say that the dawat is the duty of every individual Muslim as per the Quran. And let there be arising a nation from you, inviting all that is good, enjoining what is right, and forbidding what is wrong, and those will be the successful. So this is Amr bil Maruf wa Nahi anil Munkar, a common concept invoked by many Dawat movements around the world. Tablighis interpret this and other passages to mean that it is the duty of each individual Muslim to preach to fellow Muslims who they see as having abandoned deen and been led astray by the dunya, by the world. The central claim of the Tablighi movement is that giving dawah to others grows one's own faith and creates certainty. So it grows iman, creates yaqeen, and incites the passion and desire to fill one's religious duties. Dawat, Tablighis insist, is first and foremost for one's own islah and only secondarily for the reform of others. I was repeatedly told that by giving dawat on the virtues of a specific practice produced or, quote, gave birth to the desire for that specific practice. While all Islamic practices cultivate inner affective dispositions that propel one to live an Islamic life, dawat, they would say, is the mother of practices, al-Amal, because it gives birth to faith and connects oneself to God's self. Apni zaat ko Allah ki zaat se jod deti hai. It therefore disciplines the animalistic passions located in the lower self, nafs, and draws one towards the spirit, ruh, the part of the self that enables one to follow God's command. Dawat is what Birjit Mayer has called a sensational form, a sacred means for mediating a relationship with transcendental power, and it is through this relationship that the Tablighi acquires the pious virtue that allows him to live an Islamic life. In this presentation, I outlined the significance of the Tablighi commitment to its distinct ritualized form of preaching and how this creates an alternative form of sovereignty and vision of moral order to that of statist Islamist movements and to the Islamic State in Pakistan. I argue that the dramatic growth of the Tablighi Jamaat represents an effort to transcend the political crisis of fragmentation and violence that characterizes social and political life in post-colonial Pakistan. See if this is working. Okay. I'm gonna kind of just keep that there. Pakistan was conceived as a homeland for Muslims. I'm covering some stuff that I'm sure is very familiar to everyone here, but it's worth framing anyway. Pakistan was conceived as a homeland for the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent, founded on the basis of the two-nation theory that posited that Hindus and Muslims of the Indian subcontinent were fundamentally distinct people with distinct religious and cultural traditions. Muslim nationalism posited that Muslims could not live freely as a minority in independent India. Despite the ostensibly secular sensibilities of Pakistan's founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Islam remained a touchstone for national identity from its inception. The Muslim League, the main engine of Muslim nationalism and the demand for an independent Pakistan, routinely invoked Islam as a basis for Muslim unity to generate support for the Pakistan movement. As David Gilmartin notes, in order to gain support for Pakistan in the elections of 1946 in the Punjab, the Muslim League posited, quote, an independent Islamic state, Azad Islami Riyasat, that would not only liberate Muslims from Hindu domination, but also protect Muslims against the threat of internal dissension and divisiveness, which was feared would tear Muslims apart along caste and clan lines as the British left India. So there was both an external threat and an internal threat, and the Muslim League posited Islam as this sort of unifying framework. This is Gilmartin's argument, which others might disagree with, but I find it useful. In 1949, less than 2 years after Pakistan's founding, the Constituent Assembly passed the Objectives Resolution, which declared sovereignty belongs to Allah alone, quote, sovereignty belongs to Allah alone, but He has delegated it to the state of Pakistan through its people for being exercised within the limits prescribed by Him as a sacred trust. State sovereignty was formally linked to Islam at the outset of the new nation state, but it also wrestled with an internal tension between, on the one hand, the idea that Pakistan should be governed according to divine law, and on the other, that it should be determined by the will of the people. All governments have had to navigate this tension and strike some balance, hoping to align the will of the people with the will of God. From Pakistan's inception, Islamists like those of the Jamaat Islami argued that Pakistan must move in the direction of an Islamic state and this Islamic ideals, and this required the creation of an Islamic state. Yet it was the military dictatorship of General Zia-ul-Haq that formalized and intensified this link between Islam and the state, invigorating the sense that Islam is the basis for state sovereignty. Zia's Islamization, as we all know, had far-reaching consequences. It expanded the scope of Islamic law. It established the federal Shariat courts, the notorious Hudud ordinances, which prescribe harsh punishments for adultery and fornication, and required women to present 4 male witnesses as proof in cases of sexual assault, among other things. Anti-minority legislation, like the Ordinance 20 that prohibited Ahmadis, who had been declared non-Muslims in 1974, from claiming the status of Muslim, and so on. Islamization mandated the teaching of Islam in schools and generally promoted Islamic institutions. While all this was enacted in the name of creating an Islamic unity, scholars show that it had further exacerbated and entrenched deep political divisions along ethnic and sectarian lines. And I'm going to skip over this part. Usually I cover some parts of Pakistan's history, but I think many people here are familiar with it. I will argue that it is precisely the failure of political Islamism to constitute an Islamic totality and a transcendent, encompassing unity against ethnic and sectarian fragmentation that furnishes Dawat really with its moral force in Pakistan. Okay, so just some pictures of the Tablighi Jamaat. Okay, we don't need that. Let's see, 1 second. Okay. I'm going to skip over Karachi's crisis. Most of us are familiar with Karachi. Karachi is, of course, some would consider this stereotyping Karachi as the world's most dangerous city. This was Foreign Policy magazine. We may not accept entirely such characterizations, but Karachi is ethnic, has been an ethnically volatile city, and ethnically and sectarian volatile city. So I'm gonna kind of skip over this part of the presentation in the interest of time. But the backdrop of much of the research that I did among the Tablighi Jamaat was that Karachi's kind of political and economic fragmentation and crisis was a constant source of conversation for the Tablighis I did research among. Okay. The central claim of the Tablighi movement is that Dawat is not for the benefit of others, but crucially is for the reform or correction of the self. Dawat, I was repeatedly told, is designed to grow one's faith and create the passion and desire to fill religious duties. The transformative power of Dawat was recounted in countless narratives, like the following. A young man who was clean-shaven was going to Canada for studies, and he was worried about his faith, so he decided to go visit the imam of his mosque and to ask what he should do to not lose his faith. Imam Sahib, I'm very worried that I will go abroad and be drawn away from Islam. What should I do to protect my faith? Without hesitation, the imam said, spend time with Muslims and give dawat to others. Invite them to come to the mosque for prayers. The young man agreed. A few years later, the young man returned to his mosque, and the imam was very pleased to see him. The man now had a beard and wore his kurta above his ankles. He had become pious. The imam asked him if he had remembered to give dawat, and the young man nodded. What happened? The imam inquired. The young man replied, I felt uncomfortable at first, but because I had made a commitment, I continued to do it. Did anyone come to the mosque? Asked the imam. The man replied, no, not many, but I began praying 5 times a day, and the rest you can see. In these stories, a young man of the kind who is most prone to losing his way, with a modest level of faith indicated by his lack of a beard and his generally un-Islamic appearance, would be departing to a foreign country where he is likely to be further influenced by un-Islamic ways. The young man goes abroad, and instead of coming back less pious as one might expect, actually comes back much more devout and a practicing Muslim than he was before he left. And this transformation is often attributed to the power of dawat. When you give dawat to others, it encourages you to model yourself on the prophetic example yourself. This understanding of Dawat fits well with the descriptions of Islamic pietists in Egypt by Sabah Mahmud and Charles Hirschkind. These scholars have shown that rituals in Islam, far from being merely representations of an already given reality, are actually understood to be disciplinary practices that cultivate virtuous dispositions in the practitioners. These scholars show that rituals like mandatory prayer, namaz, and sermon listening cultivate morally laden affective dispositions like humility, pious fear, patience, and love, which are the basis for an ethical life. As Hirschkind notes, sermon listening is not merely about understanding the content of sermons, but is understood as a disciplinary practice that, quote, hones the senses and attunes the heart to God's word and inclines the body to moral conduct. Similarly, Tablighis describe Dawat as a disciplinary practice that produces the interior state of faith and therefore lays the ground for all other Islamic practice. Because Dawat gives birth to faith, Tablighis, of course, refer to it as the mother of practices and the basis for an Islamic life. Much of what I study is sort of the ritualized production of Dawat as a modeling of the prophetic example and the Sahaba and the kind of relations that they imagine to have existed in that original generative moment of Islam. So I'm not covering all the details of this, but there are a few features of Dawat as a ritual that I want to point to. Dawat, Tablighis insisted, must be conducted in a face-to-face or heart-to-heart manner. Tablighis draw on broader Islamic tradition of what Brinkley Messick has called recitational logocentrism, in which the human voice is seen as the unmediated and direct and most reliable means for conveying truth. Second, Tablighis say that Dawat requires sacrifice, qurbani, in three forms: physical energy or life force, jaan, wealth, mal, and waqt, time. The more sacrifice that a person has made in Dawat, the more he elicits God's power to create transformations in both himself and others. And third, and crucially, Dawat is a collective practice, ijtimai amal, rather than an individualistic practice, infiradi amal, which means it draws its force from being conducted in the group, Jamaat. These three features are, to borrow an apt phrase from J.L. Austin, the felicity conditions of Dawat. In practice, this means that Tablighis travel and live together in mosques in order to directly preach the virtues of Islamic practice to fellow Muslims. The close proximate living is said to produce ties, jor, between Muslims that are based on the good, achepe, or ethical relationships, which in turn keep a person on the right path. Hence, while Dawat creates an ethical self, this self is a product of the ethical relationships forged through the ethical work of Dawat. Understood through the idioms of love, care, and concern, these ethical relationships are, I will argue, the structured hierarchically. This is really important for my overall arguments. Tablighis say that Dawat is a practice that simultaneously brings Muslims into a relationship with God and with each other. Through the collective ethical work of Dawat, the congregation draws divine vitality, barakat, from God and creates bonds between them and allow them to, quote, stand together on the good. It is hard to overstate the significance of these ethical relationships in Tablighi discourse. Tablighis told me frequently how when they spend time with good Muslims, they find it hard to break God's commands. These relationships simultaneously remind them of their commitment to God and to the Islamic community. When asked what these relationships entailed, Tablighis described them in terms of love, respect, care, and concern, affective dispositions that, quote, God puts in our hearts. Indeed, God's presence is felt in these relationships, which is why one must always be in the company of other pious people. It is these ethical relationships that discipline a person and keep him from drifting away from the congregation. This is why Dawat is understood as an ijtimai amal rather than an infiradi amal. Tablighi relationships are primarily male relationships, and they are modeled on kin relationships between brothers on the one hand and between brothers and fathers on the other. Tablighis add the title brother, bhai, before each other's names, and they confer paternal authority onto the leaders of the movement, who they refer to endearingly as the elders, the buzurg of the movement. These kin terms connote hierarchy associated with South Asian models of kinship, in which younger siblings pay deference to older siblings by referring to them by the various honorific titles. Similarly, the relationship between the congregation and the elders is modeled on the ideas of hierarchical ties between fathers and sons, and older and younger generations. There's a sort of gender aspect to this, of course, that I want to touch on here. Just make sure I have my time is okay. The fact that the Tablighi congregation is overwhelmingly a male space, and these bonds are conceptualized primarily in terms of brother-brother and father-son relationships, is a central aspect of life inside the congregation. Tablighis uphold and adhere to broader Islamic norms of parda, in which only men and women who are either married or unmarriageable mahram can and should interact. Women incite male passions and sexual impulses and should be avoided except in legally sanctioned relationships. In this sense, women are understood as a temptation, fitna, the word that also means chaos, right? In which women are widely understood to be the primary source. So gender segregation is understood as a basis of moral order. Women travel on dawat tours called masturat, a term that both means women and, of course, also the word satur is the hidden part. So there's a very strong emphasis on parda, and parda is kind of seen as the basis of the moral order. Women do go on tours, usually accompanied by husbands and fathers. Itinerant women preach to other women within the host's home, while men live and preach in the mosque. Women do not give sermons. They're usually barred from giving sermons, which men give to the women who listen from behind a curtain. And this kind of establishes a patriarchal hierarchical relationship of woman as listener and male as speaker. While men's bodies and words should resonate across the country and even around the world, women's bodies and words should be confined primarily to the home. So one finds here a set of homologous hierarchies: male, female, mosque, home, religion, world, spirit, lower self, ruh, nafs. These distinctions are understood in both temporal and spatial terms, in that male, religion, and spirit are enduring and spatially expansive, while female, world, and lower self are fleeting and spatially circumscribed. This gender hierarchy in which men encompass women is sort of foundational, really. So no question about it, hierarchy, patriarchy are tied together. But one of the arguments that I make in my work, in my larger work, is that what happens in the dawah tour for men is that men often take on these kind of, especially when the women are not around, in the mosque. The mosque becomes a kind of domestic space in which men take on work that is generally deemed feminine in the home. So the mosque becomes a kind of home in which men assume feminine work, cooking and cleaning, and so on. And this work is understood, khidmat, is understood in terms of khidmat, and it's understood to be a kind of essential aspect of life in the Tablighi Jamaat, right? You spend time in the mosque, you live in the mosque is a home, you clean the mosque, you cook in the mosque. So you do these things, and this is understood to sort of establish or fend off against takabbur, against hubris. So it produces the idea of humility, inkisari, khushu in Arabic, and this that while doing this kind of work cultivates a self that is humble and capable. And in fact, the idea is that it also offsets some of the tendencies within dawat itself, because dawat involves the assumption of authority, Islamic authority over others, and it involves the modeling of behavior on the prophetic example. There's this fear that you will take on too much authority, you will claim too much close proximity to the Prophet and come to establish yourself as a type of authority. So that tendency, which is understood in this heat-cool idiom, so dawat while preaching produces a kind of heat effect, the heat of iman. But sobat, the companionship with other tablighis, cools and sort of contains that process, so it offsets that humility. Humility is part. So one of the things I look at is how in the homosocial space of the mosque, defined by spirit and religion, men assume a kind of feminine position in relationship to a male deity. So there's I've written an article on this, on what I call pious masculinity, in which the sort of the idea is that you cultivate these virtues that are generally associated, softness, humility, often associated with femininity, and incorporate that. And this is really like kind of foundational to how Tablighis think about the production of masculinity. central to the Tablighi Jamaat is, as Brian Silverstein has studied in the Naqshbandi Sufi order, the idea of sobat, spiritual realization or cultivation of ethical dispositions requires mystical techniques that involve companionship or sobat with the sheikh. For the proper formation of character, Silverstein writes, one should always be in the company of good people, defined as those who seek approval from God and only God and are not led astray by popular fashion, prestige, and power. The Tablighi Jamaat draws on this Sufi model of Islamic companionship, but while Islamic authority in the Sufi model is transmitted through ijazat, through authorization by a sheikh, in the Tablighi Jamaat, dawat is the duty of all Muslims, and Islamic authority can be created by anyone through participation in the movement. But sobat congeals the idea of ethical listening and creates a hierarchical mode of relationality wherein one, a tablighi, subordinates oneself to pious others, those deemed to have more religious authority than oneself, and is acted upon by these pious others. This sobat is understood as a necessary condition for the realization of piety because it offsets the process of dawat itself by virtue of replicating. So, as I said, it sort of cuts against the potential hubris, takabbur, that is created in the dawat process. Tablighi is often used the metaphor of a glass vase. In order to create a vase, you must heat the glass, but then you must shape it and cool it. And so the hierarchical relationality in sobat is a means to cool the passions and to mold them into proper shape. Okay? And so a lot of what I study is the way that sobat in the Tablighi Jamaat is basically materialized in practices of deference to authority, and a lot of this deference is materialized in citation of both textual authorities and authorities within the Tablighi congregation. So I look at citation the same way that we cite sources, citationality as a mode of referencing authority in order to distance yourself from the highest of authorities. So you create a kind of distance, and any authority, you reference the authority because that's the model to which you will become in the future. But there's an effort to always defer the realization of piety to the future. Okay, I call this there's a slow process of becoming that the citation does this work of kind of deferring. Okay, so this is important. Now, this is important for my argument here right now. I'm sorry, I'm kind of running a little late on time. On dawat again and politics. Barbara Metcalf has argued that Tablighi Jamaat is an apolitical quietist movement because it shuns formal engagement with politics. But in Pakistan, where state sovereignty has become deeply entangled with Islam and where all manner of Islamic actors claim to be working towards the establishment of an Islamic state, the Tablighi position against politics is even more developed and brings them into conflict with all manner of Islamist political movements. The Tablighi concern about Islamism was forcefully brought to my attention one evening when a mutual acquaintance who had been coming to mosque suddenly stopped participating in the movement, in the mosque activities. After discovering that he had joined an Islamist political party at his university, the others became very concerned about him and planned to do a khasusi gasht, a special visit to his home. I asked, why are they so worried about him if they believed he was pursuing his passion for Islam in other ways? And one of them promptly explained, quote, he has passion, but he is very far from practice. Such undisciplined passion, in other words, was itself a dangerous thing. The most common accusation Tablighis lodge against Islamists is that of takabbur, hubris, arguing that by locating agency in their own self rather than God, Islamists conflate issue for source and signifier for signified, falling prey to the worship of the self. They often say khud-parasti. Politics is a form of khud-parasti. Tablighis claim that this worship of the self inheres in Islamist political practice and is not only ineffective but is also dangerous. Maqsood, a taxi driver and longtime Tablighi, was forceful in highlighting this danger. I knew this young man who was part of some party, and he would go off to these rallies each day, and sometimes, like us, he would even go to the villages, not for dawat, of course, but he said he was going for Islam. But you know, he would come back and he would fight with his family, with his wife, and beat his children also, even his parents, and he never had any peace at home. His neighbors were also all wary of him. Everyone said that he was an angry person and had hardness of temperament. Sakht mizaj banda tha. He has passion for Islam, but he is home fighting with his parents and his wife. His passion is just his lower self speaking, his nafs speaking, and this is what gives birth to anger and aggression in him. How is someone like this going to bring others to Islam? When we come back home from Dawat, we come back with a sense of peace. It creates softness of temperament and makes us feel calm and cool. Dawat awakens your spirit and brings God's support. Because it fails to take proper ritual form, Islamism, political Islam, is not only inefficacious but also threatens to invert the Islamic moral order by producing undisciplined subjects who claim to represent Islam. In this narrative, the lower self is the one speaking and producing passions and dispositions that are precisely the opposite of those produced in Dawat. Contrasts of high, low, soft, hard, cold, hot are all inverted, the former being subordinated to the latter. The inversion of piety creates a person who is incapable of caring for those below, wife and children, and respecting those above, parents. That is, a person who fails to understand and disregards his place in a hierarchical order. The worship of the self disrupts harmonious relationships in the family, between families, neighbors, and in the Islamic community more generally, creating the conditions for moral chaos, fitna. This is how the Tablighis understand it. We can discuss, what you think about that. But so they draw this boundary between religion, deen and dunya, religion and politics, with this very particular understanding of politics as a site of the worship of the self. Right? About a couple minutes, maybe. Yeah. Okay. The sharp contrast Tablighis draw between themselves and Islamists frames the Tablighi commitment of Dawat against state-driven Islamization in Pakistan. Tablighis insist that the state is not the means through which Islamic virtue can be spread because, as one Tablighi explained, quote, the government cannot put love in people's hearts, only Allah can put love in people's hearts. The government, he said, is, quote, the greatest idol, sabse bada but, because it makes people think that Islam is being spread, but in fact does nothing to create Muslims who can live by God's will. Tablighis were not opposed to the Islamic State on principle, but they insisted that only Dawat could ultimately bring such a state. Because this critique centered on forms of agency, it is not exclusively limited to to state Islam either. It applied equally to other modern institutions like banks and NGOs, which Tablighis understood as embodying the same false attribution of agency to the self. So, in a sense, the proliferation of idols was a fundamental problem of modernity. All these institutions that we worship are basically idols, institutions of the public sphere. The sharp boundary Tablighis draw between Dawat as the basis of moral order and politics as a quintessential source of moral chaos is underpinned by distinct moral concerns about how self-authorized, individuated knowledge creates unruly forms of agency that tear apart the Islamic community. To understand the political significance of the Tablighi stance on politics requires taking a deeper look at the entanglement of Islam with state sovereignty in Pakistan, and especially against the backdrop of state Islamization and the fragmentation of Pakistani social and political life. The pendulum swing between state authoritarianism, centralization, and Islamization on the one hand, and democratization, provincialization, and ethnicization on the other provides a broad frame for understanding the intersecting forms of violence in urban Pakistan. For the Tablighis I came to know, Karachi's crisis, evidenced both by quotidian and dramatic forms of violence and by deep ethno-linguistic and sectarian divisions, was among the clearest signs that Muslims had abandoned Islam and fallen into a state of moral chaos. State Islamization from the 1970s and 1980s and the rise of a range of new Islamic actors and institutions, including corporations, banks, NGOs, televangelists, etc., all of which claim the mantle of Islamic authority. This Islamic revivalist activity has placed Islamic piety at the center of social and political life, but it has also proliferated claims and counterclaims to Islamic authority, leading to an intense fragmentation of Islamic authority in public life. The process of state Islamization and the marketization of Islam has produced deep anxieties that Islamic authority is becoming a ruse for the pursuit of self-interest and domination, and thus unmoored from ethical life. Stereotypes about Maulvis and mullahs being driven by base desires and interests abound in Pakistani public discourse, and such discourses are not just from those who advocate for a secular public sphere. You hear these even in the mazhabi tabqas. One of the key failures of the Islamization of political and economic life is that it has engendered deep concerns across many segments of the population that Islamic authority has been emptied of its ethical substance. It is against this backdrop, this is the conclusion, it is against this backdrop that Dawat's popularity as a sacrifice for God and pious authority generated in Dawat comes to be seen as a solution to the crisis of political fragmentation and the basis for the moral regeneration of Islamic life. In his work on Sufi Islam in Turkey, Brian Silverstein argues that the expansion of mass-mediated forms of Islam has created a, quote, nostalgia for immediation, a desire for a return to the original voiced presence of God embodied in the face-to-face interaction. Indeed, the Tablighi investment in the face-to-face nature of Dawat and embodied co-presence in the mosque reflects the nostalgia for mediation against not only mass-mediated forms of Islam, but also their entanglement with modernist institutions and profit-driven aims. In a context where state Islamization has generated deep divisions and conflicts, the commitment to the ritual immediacy of Dawat is also a, quote, structural nostalgia for a spiritual hierarchy that is separate from the social and political hierarchies of political and economic life. The nostalgia for hierarchy is also what Charles Pio has aptly described as the nostalgia for the future, insofar as hierarchy is the means for the moral transformation of the self and the creation of an Islamic moral order in the future. The argument here is, of course, not that Islamic piety can address the crisis of moral reproduction in Pakistan. The violent fragmentation that we see in Pakistan is entangled with state centralization and authoritarianism, particularly by the Pakistani military. And Pakistan, like most countries in the global south, is characterized by rampant economic inequality and exploitation by capitalist classes. So this is my causal explanation for it. One cannot genuinely transcend the fragmentation and violence that permeates everyday life in Pakistan without a radical democratization of power and economic redistribution. What then can we say about the moral and political intervention of Islamic piety as a response to the effects of these underlying processes? The moral intervention of Islamic piety is an effort to manage and reformulate domestic and political and economic hierarchies to make them more habitable. It is a kind of habitation of modernity. Dawat aims to produce a form of pious masculinity that encourages men to enact their responsibilities as fathers, sons, and husbands in the domestic domain. This pious masculinity also provides the model of hierarchical care for institutions of the state and economic life, and thus for sovereignty more broadly. Through the enactment of the prophetic model and the cultivation and spread of pious virtue, the Tablighi Jamaat aims to domesticate the powers of modern life, political and economic, and make them capable of fulfilling their hierarchical function of benevolent rule. Rather than aim to eliminate worldly hierarchies, Islamic piety is an approach that presumes the existence of these hierarchies and aims to anchor them in pious authority, and through that in the transcendent will of God. Tablighi constructions of religion foreground principles of responsibility and care and aim to create a spiritual hierarchy that is separate from but also capable of domesticating the powers of the modern world. In a world of deep political, economic, and ecological crises, recognizing Islamic piety as a distinct hierarchical model of care and responsibility grants us insight into the broader place of religious revivalism and hierarchical imaginaries in modernity. Thank you.
I'll be opening up for the Q&A from the audience. Have a few comments to both of our esteemed speakers, Professor Arsalan and Dr. Eldridge. Thank you for these wonderful talks. I'll start with Dr. Eldridge over here. And when I was listening to both of these talks, it just reminded me that back in 2014, right at this stage, we had two people sitting. Professor Sabah Mahmood was sitting here, and Dr. Asif Farooqi was hosting the session, and we were all sitting over here. And since yesterday, I've been listening to Professor Mulji's, Hoja Mulji's talk and other talks And today's talk, this resonance of Professor Sabah Mahmood still there. May God bless their soul. Both of them are not with us anymore in this world. But having said that, I was also reminded when I was listening to you about this ambivalence of emptiness and fulfillment, that, and then you quoted from this verse from Quran about the Satan and he's entering Adam's mold and then saying, finding it hollow. But then the divinity responds with saying that but those who will resist your temptation will be mukhlisud lahuddin, those who have the ikhlas, and then ikhlas is where the hollowness gets filled by this divinity, right? And this is where you get to become as mukhlis as the divinity itself. But then in order to get to this hollowness, you need to have this deconstruction. And that is where the problem is. I mean, I was listening to this talk yesterday from what Noman was saying, and quoting Sheikh Sulaiman Faruqi. We don't even understand what exactly is broken. So in order to get the hollow and the vacuum and then to have it, let it filled by the divinity, we just don't know what exactly we need to deconstruct. And that is where the problem, I guess, arises for us. So I'd like you to comment on that. And then we'll have one more question with you and then open it up.
Yes, thank you very much for that question and comment. I think that's really, yes, precisely, and that's precisely why it's this question of lucidity, which is what I opened up with. So, because this, there's this amazing, I actually don't know where I think he lived in Lebanon for a time. His name is Jalal Tawfiq, and he wrote a book called The Withdrawal of Tradition Past a Surpassing Disaster. And he's very insistent on precisely this point, that it's precisely the lack of lucidity about what has withdrawn that is the problem. And so the first step, you can say, and this is what Jabor is sort of affecting, the problem, even to point to the problem of the counterfeit, is the beginning of this process, the fact of that anxiety of the double that returns in the form of renewal at times, not to make a specific comment on this, but precisely that anxiety around renewal being inauthentic. So yeah, I think that there's certainly no answer here because it precisely opens the problem.
Right, and that also brings us to the title of our panel, which is the politics of spiritual ethicality. And you begin with this text from the Eastern Christian monastic tradition in the 20th century. And then your conclusion is very important for us, is that often we see that because it's coming from a different tradition, the practices and then the inspiration and then the traditions are entirely different, and this is exactly what modernity has done with us. And so reconstruction, how do you think we should proceed from here? Because, and in the context of Lebanon, and of course, but in the more universal context. So this idea that, and you can see that there's so many references that you were quoting from this text about Ibrahim in the Khalil, and this idea of being the Khalili and then being intimate to God and then being mukhlis, and then bringing this idea is not actually, so just coming back to, again, from destruction to reconstruction, or bringing in, how do you build these bridges?
And I think that maybe this is part of what I found so interesting about the text itself, is that it does not mark itself out as doing the work of reconstruction, but precisely through a grammatical shifting indexes a kind of genealogy that I can draw out for us, but is entirely opaque for his audience. And so this to me is very peculiar, because it's not a work of ecumenism, let's say, something like this. But instead, I think, again, it requires a different theoretical vision that, and a kind of attentiveness to the way in which these traditions are enfolded, as a condition of their existence today. And sectarianism is a procedure of creating a kind of differentiation, the kind of obsession with producing a specific religious difference or something like this, that does not exhaust the reality of the world in which we live. And so I think, the kind of study I was trying to perform for people today is looking to do a kind of work of attentiveness, which I think is very felicitous to anthropology even.
Absolutely. Thank you, and we'll open up the floor in a minute, but I have two short questions. And going back to this anecdote that you were showing us to the taxi driver, and bringing in this idea of morality, and then to be passion, and then cooling it down. If I'm not mistaken, the taxi driver that you were quoting was saying that this person is bad, and because he's bad to his family and is bad to his children and bad at home, if I'm getting it right. And then I was listening to the other slides that you were saying, when the part of going to this gasht, and then this whole practice of ethicality that the Tablighi Jamaat brings in is basically to become more ethical and moral. And then when they come back home, they are expected to be, according to their bade or elders, to be better husbands and then brothers and sisters, and then the way they construct it. What has been your observation about that? I mean, do they really bring in this sense of morality and ethics, and is it expected from them to, when they are being detached and then going through the mosque, and then bringing in the so-called the chores that the women in our society are supposed to be doing it, and that brings some humility, of course, but also to appreciate the other side, that they have actually they were detached for a brief period of time, but they were doing their gasht. So maybe you can.
Yes, I think that, you know, one of the things they say about policy, they'll point to like a rally. And if you go to a rally and people are waving flags, and I've been to many Islamist rallies, and you put a mic in front of people, and they have, you know, it's politics, right? It's familiar politics. It's the kind of thing, you know, so that they see that as encouraging a mode of agency or ethics, the space of politics itself that undermines Iman. So that's what he's saying, right? He's saying, oh, he's going to these rallies and he's doing this thing, and so he's contrasting that with the social space of the masjid, the social space of the Jamaat and the Sohbat and so on. Everyone asks me the same question. Does it actually work? Right? Does it actually happen? They have this model of this idea.
I'm actually not asking about the actually happening, but is it that expected from them, according to their practice?
Yes, I think it is expected. So once you set up a model in ritual, this is a thing, right? And you publicly announce an allegiance to that model does in fact hold you to account. This is one thing we understand why people do rituals, is because rituals produce ethical or moral models. Now you can say that person is not actually going to act like that, but once you make a public statement, I'm living according to the prophetic model, then it does actually lead that people can hold you account to that public persona. And so, of course, there's hypocrisy and people don't do it, but I'm interested in the way that the production of that model does, in fact, become a socially relevant way in which people can be evaluated ethically. So that's, I think, the real question. It's impossible for me and the millions of people in the Tablighi Jamaat to know whether they're soft at home or not. But what does matter is that the model of softness is cultivated and created and circulated.
It's in the model that is there.
Yes, it's in the ritual. That's why we do rituals.
But that brings us to the second dimension of the model, which is what you were suggesting, and I'm sure it is the case, because as far as I understand, it's the part of being detached and going through the safar and being part of the company of the pious and the people is also, and then doing these, taking up the stuff, and then you're living in the mosque, and then cooking and washing your own clothes and whatever. It's to bring in the humility as well. So you are basically whoever you are at home, you are a different person now.
Yes.
But now coming, because you touched upon the politics side as well, and towards the end, you've seen that that was probably what Ilyas Kandhalwi was doing it back in the 1920s, that the original idea started in pre-partition. And then for a very some decades that they were still doing it without much publicity. But now you can see that, just like any other movement, there are now these celebrities and then faces that basically are claiming, as you just said, about that, okay, look, we are pious, and then all of these things. So is it not a contradiction that we are saying it from what exactly was the way it was formulated in the beginning, and how it has manifested recently?
There are many tensions in it. So people like Tariq Jamil, who are obviously very public and involved in companies and all, so they have a tense. There's an internal tension of a relationship. On the one hand, this produces publicity, right? So all of this is about publicity. It's not just that you're living with the people you're not just acting on yourself. You are modeling yourself on the Prophet and making a public statement that I'm living according to the Prophet. Thus, you can be held to account for claiming that connection. So there's a desire in the Tablighi Jamaat to model prophetic example, to encourage other people, right? So you're trying to spread that model to other people, so you live according to the example. But there's a tension, right? Some people end up becoming very famous, like Tariq Jamil, and they're wrapped up with the making of money in ways. So people like that do actually have a tension with the buzurgs of the Tablighi Jamaat, because they, on the one hand, are able to spread the Tablighi Jamaat, but they're also open the Jamaat up to a certain criticism of hypocrisy, of pursuing money, of chasing money. So that's all I could say. There's internal criticism, right, about people like Tariq Jamil or about Vital Science Wala, Junaid Jamshed,
and who bringing in sports as well,
able in a sense to extend the movement, but we're also perilously extending it and potentially undermining its moral substance.
I think
so
it's very...
There's a tension within publicity itself. This is another kind of theoretical point I make in one of my articles.
So you want your movement to be successful, of course, and the opening up requires some publicity too, and some celebrity profiles as well. We'll open up the floor for Dr. Aaron Eldridge and Professor Arsalan, Noman, and then right after you, and then we'll take maybe the third one over there. Please. Can we Professor Naqvi ke paas hai, please.
Thank you for those excellent presentations. What a feast we are having since yesterday. Both Aaron and Arsalan, those were really amazing presentations. Thank you so much. I just want to make a quick point which might be, I don't know, fruitful. So when you brought up the question of reconstruction, because this question, of course, comes up all the time. So I also couldn't pass up the opportunity to make a comment in this regard, given the valence of this word or the significance of this word in our own intellectual history. Because, of course, Muhammad Iqbal wrote a book called The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, which was an entirely modernist text. Who, except a modern, would be so extraordinarily arrogant to think that they could reconstruct right, religious thought in Islam? What a project. Remarkable. Even the Prophet did not make such a claim. The Prophet did not say that I am bringing a new tradition. Hey, here's this new cool religion. He said he was returning to the original. So in wanting to return to the original, we are following the Prophet. Because he himself wanted to return to the original. He did not claim that he was doing anything new, which is characteristically a modernist gesture, obviously, since modernity is all about the new. Right? So better than reconstruction, I think, would be reorientation. Even what your author is talking about is a reorientation. And what Arsalan is talking about as well. And others also. The gesture, I think, the gesture that we are all making in different ways is that of a reorientation, which is a classic quote-unquote religious gesture anyway. That's what all the great...
Right. So can you pass on the mic to the people right there behind you?
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I want to ask a question with Mr. Aaron, that you explained the concept of the term samad, and you also talked about how it is misinterpreted previously. So why the researcher is not taking the term samad in the context of being seamless, having no emptiness within it, or taking it something is very flawless or free from all the negative spaces or anything that we can associate with not being complete. So that is my question.
Yeah, so I kind of I went over that. I glossed that too quickly, I think. So what was happening there, and it actually is demonstrative, though, of the point, is that an Arab Orthodox writer, Theodore Abu Qura, translates some Quran into Greek. And this word he uses for Samad, people read him today, this is the kind of rereading. The first he's read as saying, oh, it's making a kind of like counter-Islamic or sectarian claim and saying that Samad is actually showing that this is an idealization, that there's literally an idol here. That's what his translation is doing. But this Christos Simelidis is actually saying, no, in fact, Abu Qura understood what a Samad meant within the terms of Quranic Arabic itself, and his translation is actually felicitous. It's because precisely it has these features that you're describing. So that is also, I found kind of interesting, right? This assumption that this translation from Arabic to Greek from an indigenous Christian tradition would produce a kind of sectarian claim rather than any attempt at felicity.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is for Professor Arsalan. Thank you very much for a very interesting session. However, during the course of the lecture, I was slightly struggling to understand what is the analytical framework that you're taking for your research. So, I did understand that you have certain Western ideas over there, but it seemed as if that we are taking a very Western lens to analyze the Tablighi Jamaat. Is my understanding correct?
Well, we're taking an anthropological lens. I suppose that's a Western lens, yes. It's an analytic that looks at ethics and ritual, definitely.
And so, was there any specific addition to the scholarly literature that was made as a result of this research?
So, the work of scholars like Sabah Mahmood have looked at sort of Islamic ritual as a means of ethical self-cultivation. My work is probably not as evident in this presentation. It takes a slightly different, more intersubjective, semiotic approach. I look at sign processes and the ways in which the performance of a prophetic model ends up creating a certain kind of intersubjective moral responsibility. So it shifts away from self-cultivation, which is a Foucauldian approach, to look at performance, and how these performances create a kind of space. So what it opens up, I'll just say what it opens up, which I think was not fully developed in some of the literature on Islamic piety, is it opens up the space for intersubjective relationships and the institutionalized process by which, so the Tablighi Jamaat is effectively a bureaucracy, right? And how is that bureaucracy formulated in practice? So it looks very carefully at that. Now the way that Tablighis understand the domain of religion, ye deen hai aur wo dunya hai, and this contrasts them with political parties and with other types of Islamic organizations, is based on their very particular organization, which is organized, I said, around Sobat, which I didn't really unpack a lot of, right? But the particular organization of Sobat. So a shift analytically helps us open the space to think about how religious movements are institutionalized and how they draw boundaries around the sphere of religion in specific ways. That's what it does.
Right, we'll take one more question,
yes.
I guess. Maybe Terry.
Yes,
Go ahead.
Namely, Shakil Shahzad, I am a teacher of and a student of Islamic history. My question is concerned about the Tablighi Jamaat. Sir, respectively, you mentioned here that the Tablighi Jamaat only about not post-colonial, it is about 200, 300 year movement from Deoband institutions. Sir, what is the current situation and current scenario and current problem of Islamic world? politically, economically, as well as Tabiri, is not to resolve Tablighi Jamaat. Tablighi Jamaat on focus on person, be politely, be moderate, pabandi deen, to follow the instruction. When the behavioristic approaches are different, as you mentioned in taxi driver is there. And when do you get opportunities, you get money or business from capture. Just Dil Pakistan is singer, is just his brand, launch a brand. Tariq Jamil are also there. They are not to follow a foot there. Sir, is the current situation, Tablighi Jamaat is have any what is the, which era and which ruler is followed the Tablighi Jamaat principle and procedures and to occupy the and found the established government? Just, I'm not a...
Right, so can we just we need to have one more question as well.
Islamic revolution of Iran is settled down by Iran. As Tablighi Jamaat is mentioned and established in any country or they are to found...
Okay. Thank you, Professor Aslan. You want to respond to what you're saying? Okay, so we have room for one more question. Do you have any student over here? There's one over there, maybe. Shiji Shahab, please. I would like one of our students to take it.
Excuse me.
Take it. Shahab, yahan pe ji. Idhar ji. It's okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. My question is for Professor Arsalan. I just want to understand, what the perception of Tablighi Jamaat is about the Shias and other sects. How they try to interpret or try to convert or counter the arguments of, Shia teaching. So thank you so much.
I think I received this question a lot because I had there's a very tense sectarian situation in Pakistan and a lot of attacks on minority sects in general. So my experience, again, Tablighi Jamaat is a very big organization. If you listen to Tablighi Bayan, you might get a sense of the dominant discourses in the Tablighi Jamaat, and then you can only do research in a small section of them, right? And Tablighis generally are not preaching across sectarian divides. Mostly they focus on Sunni Muslims. They make sure in Multan, I went on a Dawat tour Gasht in Multan, they avoid Shia areas. And my experience is that their understanding is that we need to keep a kind of sectarian peace. Of course, they believe that their own understanding of piety and their own, both Sunni Islam is correct and their understanding of piety is particular, but I think they do see the threat to sectarian harmony that is posed by political Islamic movements and Islamization of the state, which they think that can be better managed through a kind of interpersonal relationship. So one of the things that we find in literature on secularism in the state or religion in the state is that actually it ends up deepening sectarian divisions, and we see this in Pakistan, that Islamization ended up deepening the sectarian divisions and keeping people into their kind of separate categories, where Tablighis do a considerable amount of work at the neighborhood level to create some kind of ethical space. So that's what I would say.